Before I came to Connecticut in 2019, I served our congregation in Hopedale, Massachusetts. If you don't know where that is, it's next door to Hopkinton, where the Boston Marathon starts. You've probably heard of Hopkinton. You've probably not heard of Hopedale. But if you were a Universalist in the 19th century, you would have known Hopedale. It is one of our historic Universalist congregations. In 1842, Universalist minister Aidan Ballou established the Hopedale Community, a utopian, Christian, Universalist, socialist farming community. They embodied what they thought of as Universalist Christian living. They worked for peace and justice. They were abolitionists, and they rejected the sovereignty of human government. By 1852, 10 years later, the community numbered over 200. They owned 500 acres. They had their own school, their own church, post office, bank, and factory. They weren't really great business people. And in 1856, the majority shareholders, the people making the most money in the community, Ebenezer and George Draper, invented a new way to make parts for industrial looms. And they got rich. And then they stopped contributing to the community's common fund. The Hopedale community crumbled, and the town of Hopedale was born. It did not resemble the Hopedale community so much as it resembled the Gilded Age company town. The Drapers grew increasingly rich. One of them became governor of Massachusetts. And by the turn of the 20th century, after having built the Unitarian Church, the town hall, the high school, the community center, and the housing in which they rented to the people who worked in the factory, they were holding blackface minstrel shows as church fundraisers and had sundown laws in the town. The Draper brothers, while I was there, still are. Their descendants were fantastic people and very generous. But they are heroes in that town. The town's culture is built around the hagiography, the sainthoodization, not of Aidan Ballou, but of the Drapers. The Drapers are the bad guys in the story. In 1962, the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church was called in Rome, with the goal to modernize the Catholic Church. And it lasted 3 years. As part of this, Pope John XXIII established a commission in 1962 to advise him and the council on the Catholic teaching of birth control. The commission's work dragged on, and their final recommendation, a large majority of the team, including the lay experts and doctors on the panel, recommended changing the Catholic Church's teaching to allow birth control. Pope John had died, and Pope Paul VI in 1968 issued Humanae Vitae, a papal encyclical upholding the Church's ban on birth control against the recommendation of all the experts. In the early 2000s, I seemed to run into all these communities. The Unitarian Universalist Association tried to rapidly quick start a liberal megachurch in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. They hired Thomas Bandy and his company, which at the time was by far and away the leading church consultants in the Christian world. They raised over $1 million for the project. Bandy had them study all the most successful Christian megachurches and how they rapidly grew them so large, so fast. And then the UUA followed the model. They hired a huge staff. They bought a piece of land, which would eventually be the land where they built the big church building. They used a sound stage, video screens, multimedia technology. This was 2001, 2, right in there. And following the strategy that Bandy suggested, they gathered people in small private homes in small groups until they had over 200 people meeting together in small groups. And then they called them all together for common Sunday worship. And when everyone got together, they fought with each other like cats and dogs. Because in the Christian model, the small groups are made up of golfers or business people or high school students or people who like to go hiking, but they're all Christian. What the UU model did was gather a small group of Buddhists and a small group of liberal Christians and a small group of New Agers and a small group of atheists and a small group of humanists. And when they all got together, all they did was argue with each other. The UUA backed out of the project. The congregation maxed out at about 150 20 years ago, and they ended up selling the land, never building the church building, and they still rent space in a commercial area for meeting on Sunday with a lay-led congregation. Now, the most difficult lesson I had to learn in ministry is that great ideas, great programs, great worship services, great social justice involvement, and great spirituality doesn't help you be as an effective minister, as does understanding how culture works. In ministry and in other endeavors, you can have a great idea, a great plan, a great philosophy, the best of intentions, the ultimate strategy, and still fail. Because strategy loses to culture every time. Culture eats strategy for breakfast and lunch and dinner and dessert and has the leftovers for a midnight snack. Aidan Ballou had a plan for a Christian Universalist farming community of justice activists and abolitionists and pacifists. But the culture of American 19th century capitalism ate his strategy for breakfast. Leading lay health experts and doctors and psychologists in the Catholic Church in the 1960s had a great strategy for convincing the Pope and the bishops to change the teaching on birth control. And the culture of Catholicism ate their strategy for breakfast. The Unitarian Universalist Association had a strategy for quick-starting a liberal megachurch and hired the best consultants and put in an extreme amount of money. And Unitarian Universalist culture itself ate their strategy for breakfast. Culture is so powerful because so much of it is underneath the surface. If you ever see diagrams of culture when you're studying culture, it's an iceberg. They use an iceberg a lot. So you see the things like, food and the music and fashion styles. And underneath, you miss all the complexities of how people treat each other. Norms of social behavior that you have to learn by experience and modeling. And all the difficulties that come along with being involved in a time and a place and a people. The cultures we're a part of have a hold on us in ways most of us don't realize. And even when we understand how this works, a lot of it is subconscious. We're not aware of it as it's happening. Making a change in any culture, from a small group to a congregation to the Catholic Church, requires a lot of intentional planning and a strategy, not of how to do something better, but of how to change the culture itself. I think the reason politicians turn to divisive culture wars again and again is because culture is the most powerful social and political force there is. It is the easiest way to divide people along lines of culture, things that are ingrained in us, in the ways we think and our behavior so deeply that we tend not to think about changes to them or oppositions to them. We just tend to react. And I think that's why you see things like LGBTQ issues and abortion and climate change denial and the validity of vaccines being all the major political issues that we tend to argue about. They're easy to divide people along lines of culture. It is more difficult to get a person to understand and change their cultural practices than it is to get them to understand rational argument and change their mind about something. Because culture gets embedded in us in ways that we have to really work at changing. How many of you, for example, as we go through this year of dealing with transgender inclusion in our congregation, still have trouble using someone's pronouns? I'm trying to teach you about it, and I still have trouble doing it. Not that it's right, it's the way I grew up. It's embedded in my head in ways that, like, I got to remember to consciously think about. I have to really work at it. Culture change requires that you pay attention and do a lot of intentional work. And one of the things I think that's valuable about faith communities trying to pay attention to and change their culture for the better is that faith communities have the power, when they're intentional about it, to be powerfully counter-cultural. Religion, for the most part in our time, especially in America, is profoundly adhered to, stuck to, glued to our common popular culture. So much so that in the case of some forms of Christianity in America, the religion has become the exact opposite of the ethics and values originally taught by the religion. Christianity in America has become about power, greed, violence, worshiping the powerful. And if you pay attention to the teachings of Jesus, it's about siding with the poor, fighting for the oppressed, being kind to everybody, loving others like yourself. It's very bizarre. They've created a religion that has switched cultures from the culture of the religious beliefs to the culture of the society surrounding it. I think one of the reasons we are not seeing a stronger vocalized opposition to the Trump administration right now is that the opposition party, in many ways, doesn't oppose them culturally. They may have some different political ideas, but the current Republicans in this country and the mainstream Democrats in this country have more in common culturally than either of them want to admit. And if we don't think so, well, just this week, one of the nation's leading Democrats came out against trans people's rights. Gavin Newsom in California, big anti-trans statement this week. Both of these political parties, our entire political culture, upholds the culture of corporate capitalism. And when push comes to shove, we'll uphold the status quo of corporate capitalism over meaningful and needed change that truly benefits the health, welfare, safety, and community of all of us. I don't believe either major party in our country is deeply interested in and committed to our Unitarian Universalist values. Neither of these political parties loudly champions a real living wage, guaranteed human rights for everyone, national single-payer health care, completely taking corporate money out of politics, ranked choice voting, automatic voter registration, schools funded at equal levels regardless of property tax. Property taxes to support schools is the most racist thing our country still does. Neither party supports a guaranteed basic income or dismantling prisons and demilitarizing the police or reparations for slavery or the native genocide or reorganizing our society and economy to stave off ecological devastation. Politics in our society is an argument over a kinder, slightly more inclusive version of the unhealthy system of unchecked corporate capitalism. Remember, in 2008, the Democratic Party was in power. When the financial meltdown hit, they bailed out the criminal bankers with your money. Iceland threw the bankers in jail. Culture is powerful. The culture of corporate capitalism is intensely dominant. And I think we face our current political and social crisis in our country because the hold of culture is incredibly all-encompassing. When we think about it, I think many of us have trouble even imagining a system without capitalism, colonialism, individualism, or violence, whether or not we agree with those things. I think there's a lot of us who think trying to have a system that's not all those things is going to be almost impossible to accomplish. Over the last 75 years, American culture has been confronted with substantial change after substantial change, all of which upended the entire history of this country and its cultural antecedents up to those points. Navigating all those changes are complex. And people react against them. Not because people are afraid of the change, but they're afraid of what they lose in the change. White people weren't so entrenched against civil rights because of the idea, but because they'd lose their power as white people. Right now, a bunch of white people are terrified of trans people, and a bunch of straight people are terrified of trans people for no real legitimate reason. I think all major political revolutions are revolutions of culture, of how we change the values behind what undergirds the politics. You know, the ancient Romans, when they encountered the Jewish people, thought the Jewish people were absolutely certifiably insane. They didn't use that terminology then. But they thought they were really nuts. They didn't work one day a week. Because in Roman culture, the way you became great was to achieve many deeds and do great things so they remembered you when you were dead. If you didn't do anything one day a week, that's one day less a week to do all those things that they value. They just didn't get it at all. The Romans thought that the early Jesus follower culture was absolutely insane. They included women and slaves as equal members of their community. They thought they were absolutely nuts. And the only way they were able to beat them is to co-opt their religion and make it their own official religion and then tell the slaves and women to be quiet again. Fascinating. Our government in this country, along with private corporations, literally waged war and killed people who started labor unions. You know, against all of this, in culture's powerful hold, we, however, are presented right now with an opportunity to model a new culture. We can replace the culture we've inherited of capitalist, corporate exploitation, inequality, individualism, and violence with a culture of cooperation, collaboration, mutual care, inclusion, and peace. And this is not a utopian fantasy. Word utopia comes from Greek, topos, which is place, and eu is the negative prefix. Utopia means no place. It doesn't really exist. And no place is ever going to be perfect. No system is ever going to be perfect. No culture is perfect, or obviously better than all the others. But I am convinced we can certainly create something more humane, more compassionate, more loving, more inclusive than what we've inherited. Even in this climate, we can do that. Because the climate we're facing right now isn't a political climate, believe it or not. We had a bunch of activists in here Thursday night, and Reverend John Selders from Hartford, who some of you know, said, this isn't a political matter, this is a moral matter. This is about good and evil, right and wrong, about how we treat other human beings. Someone else in the room Thursday night said, I believe, and this was a lawyer, said, I believe religion's greatest power is that it can put human rights above everything else. It doesn't always, but when it's good, it does. We need to use our language of faith when engaging people who disagree with us and who have a different culture with us. That's wrong. How do you say that what you're doing is right? How is that love? Thursday night I was reminded, and I told Reverend Selders this, of Reverend William Barber's mandate that clergy and religious people have a choice in our time. We can either be chaplains of empire, chaplains of the status quo, or prophets of God. And if God doesn't work for you, prophets of love at the center of everything. We can reject the American empire and its creation of abandoned places and people thrown away as if trash. We do not have to uphold the way it values profits over people's welfare and greed over generosity. We prophetically can proclaim and create something better to replace it. You may not think of yourself as revolutionary, and you may not think of this congregation as revolutionary, but you are, because you already practice a revolution of values that are countercultural to everything that goes on in our country. We uphold values profoundly at odds with the rest of America. American culture values control. We value justice. American culture values domination. We value equity. American culture values conformity. We value transformation. American culture values privilege. We value pluralism. American culture values independence. We value interdependence. American culture values greed. We value generosity. It's right there in our national bylaws. We changed them last spring. We even have a little superhero fluffy toy called Jet Pig. American culture values resigned indifference to the way things are. We don't. We value love. Love is the opposite of indifference. Our values invite us to create a new culture. A culture centered, like our values, on love. A culture of mutual assistance and mutual support. A culture of sharing, of shared leadership, shared wisdom, shared resources, shared wealth. A value of cooperation and collaboration. A culture of acceptance and inclusion. A culture of art and beauty. A culture that is love. Anybody know Starhawk, the pagan teacher? I really like Starhawk. I got to meet her once many years ago and do a ritual with her. And just as one of those people I've met that was as awesome a human being as you hoped they would be when you learned about them. She has a great novel about a corporate, militaristic, theocratic, authoritarian government called the Stewards. The novel is called The Fifth Sacred Thing. And in this novel, this autocratic theocracy takes over the United States in a time of ecological collapse. And the only remaining free part of the country is a little community that grows up in and around San Francisco, where they create a multicultural group of survivors of this American Civil War. And differences of color and gender and age and sexual orientation and gender expression, physical ability are not allowed in the community to restrict anyone's opportunity or access. The ancestors of many cultures are honored in ceremony and art and religious education, and every child in their community grows up speaking 3 languages: English, a cultural language related to that person, and American Sign Language. Everything they do is done democratically, kind of like our community conversations we have, right? There are no fossil fuels. Technology is minimized because they've had this massive war and ecological devastation. But they raise their own food, they clean water, they do their best to include everybody. And whoever shows up at the community's borders in need is just taken in. It's not perfect. There are jealousies and arguments and even disagreements about whether or not nonviolence will be a practical way to oppose the stewards when they show up. And they show up. And they don't resist. And the stewards are thinking they're conquering these people. But as the conquering army is forced to interact with the inhabitants, they notice that the inhabitants have food and running water. That disappeared decades ago. And what the community does is they make a plan that whenever they encounter the army that has invaded them, they tell them, there is a place set for you at our table if only you will join us. And their community was so much obviously better than the lives those soldiers knew. Well, I'll let you read the book. And this isn't just fiction. This is not just fiction. I don't know if you saw this week, but State Representative Zoe Zephyr and S.J. Howell stood up in the Montana State Legislature and spoke out beautifully against 2 anti-transgender bills. They spoke out from their own personal experience. They told the stories of their families. And 29 Republicans joined the Democrats to defeat the anti-trans legislation. There's a place for you at our table if only you will join us. We tend to think of people who hate, and we get scared because we think, what if everybody did that? And we see more and more people buying into the hate and hating, and we know that's how culture gets created and spread, and we get more scared. But we forget about the simple power of reminding people of decency and love and other values, and that everyone is just human. You may not think you can speak up. You may not think you can speak out, but you can. Anytime, any place, you can speak out. And what if everybody did that? Those who see kindness and compassion and inclusion and empathy, Mr. Musk, as weakness, find it incomprehensible that the kindness, compassion, and empathy and inclusion we have will also extend to them. There is a place for you at our table if only you would join us. The only strategy that overcomes culture is the strategy of creating a new culture so much better, so much more inclusive, so much more inviting than the old culture, that the old culture is voluntarily left behind, even to the surprise of its staunchest defenders. The new culture has to be put into practice first. It becomes a reality on a small scale, say like a congregation of all things. And over time becomes bigger to encompass more and more people who have been invited in. And although it may seem small, our mission, our covenant, our values are a new and better way, a new and better culture. And there is a place for everyone at our table if only they would join us.